Today I have the pleasure of being joined by my friend Louis Anslow, who is the founder of Pessimists Archive. It's a brilliant project that jogs our memories about moral panics and freakouts that so often greet new ideas. It's my favourite historical anecdote to pessimism, and a wonderful reminder that most of the things that we once feared are now things that we love, rely on, and even laugh about. So Louis, we've been going back and forth for a while and planning this podcast for a while, and you've identified 7 groups in society that reliably resist technological progress, and I think it's a brilliant breakdown. So why don't you share it with us?
Yeah, so a little context for listeners. Started Pessimists Archive 10 years ago, had the 10th anniversary in late 2025, and it was a lot of looking into this stuff over the years, and I was hoping to come up with some kind of framework. Like, what does it all mean? Some people think the project is, not very, doesn't have much predictive value. Things are different this time. You're cherry picking. Other people see it as a really amazing reflection of, human psychology and repeating history, and there's lots of lessons to learn. And I really wanted to boil it all down and come out, synthesize something new to mark the 10th anniversary that will help people think about this stuff. And I think I did it. And I'm calling it the 7 Deadly Cynics, or the 7 Ps of pessimism. And these are, when you look through Pessimist Archive's work, you realize that all of the people that resist new technologies almost always are groups in society who feel threatened, and their power specifically is threatened by new technology. And new technologies generally change power dynamics in various ways, and they change who has power in society. So the 7 Deadly Cynics are these subgroups in society that resist new technology reliably. And I'm going to list them. It's protectionists. So, they're incumbents in a market. They want to protect their market share or their job. There is the politicians who generally, they get funding from incumbents and the establishment. They need donations. They write the laws. So protectionists generally look to politicians to protect them. And politicians generally want to do that for various reasons, including, a big donor might be asking them, or a union with lots of voters might be asking them. So generally you find politicians are quite warm to this idea of slowing down or suppressing new technologies at the behest of protectionists. And there's also, so that's 2, protectionists and politicians. And then you have patrons, and generally patrons are the sort of old money, wealthy elites who, a lot of the times, they are protectionists of the old order, and they fund politicians, and they own companies, blah, 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 it's crony capitalism 101. And so these politicians try and appeal to other groups, like parents. So parents is another group, the 7 Deadly Cynics, and parents worry about their kids, they worry about the new generation. They miss the good old days. They've got this nostalgia develops as you get older, and you miss, your youth, and you get worried about your kids. So there's this sort of pyramid of pessimism, I call it, where you have these sort of protectionists saying to politicians, hey, can you protect our power? And then the politicians need votes as well as donations. So they say, okay, let's scare parents, and let's write a law that appeals to parents. We're going to protect the kids, but also we're going to protect the protectionists. We're going to protect the old order incumbents. And something that plays into that dynamic is preachers. That's another P. the 7 P's of pessimism, preachers are groups that like to assert moral authority. They can be secular or religious, and they generally say this thing is corrupting us, or this thing is corrupting this group or that group. And they're very persuasive. They're very good at telling stories and scaring people. And they're very, very useful for politicians and protectionists. These people, there's a few high-profile ones at the moment around smartphones and screen time. You've got Tristan Harris, you've got Jonathan Haidt, you have a handful of others. They generally sell a lot of books. They get a lot of, paid speaking gigs. They get a lot of attention. I think there was a book about this, but they sort of, especially the secular ones, are sort of moral entrepreneurs. And that's where the preachers come in. And publishers, another P. The publishers, this is the gatekeepers of, the media gatekeepers of information, the publishers, the newspapers, and generally, historically, they've been enmeshed with the old order establishment because it costs a lot of money and blah, blah, blah. So you find newspapers generally amplify this stuff. They generally sway negative. They generally amplify the narratives of the preachers that are pushed by the politicians in service of the protectionists to scare the parents to get votes. And the other P is professors. So what you find is when there's a panic about a new thing, there's this fight to prove it. You want evidence. So there's lots of studies that are funded. Like we always hear about studies being funded by industry to say something's safe. We know that this happens, and we know that that kind of research, you have to take it with a grain of salt. Don't dismiss well-designed studies, but take it with a grain of salt. There's obviously some bias there, but we generally don't talk about the stuff that goes the other way, which is when there's a panic about a new thing and there's a lot of protectionists looking to protect themselves. There's also a lot of funding going into research that's looking for a problem. So there's this massive incentive for academics to do research and studies that kind of set out to prove this scary thing is a problem. And there's very little downside. You don't get accused of being a shill or a sellout. If it turns out that these papers were wrong, there's very little consequences. If you do a study that says don't worry about this thing, and then it turns out it's bad, you're basically done. Like it's pretty. There's a pessimism privilege actually in general, where there's very little downside to being pessimistic about something. And even when the consequences are dire, like nuclear power development being slowed down, or golden rice causing millions of deaths in the developing world, or the overpopulation panic, nothing really happens. A lot of these people are still tenured professors. There's actually like pretty solid examples of millions of deaths and mass campaigns of sterilization. And it's weirdly just like, so yeah, that's the 7 Deadly Cynics: protectionists, professors, politicians, publishers, preachers, parents, and patrons, which are generally sort of, the people that fund a lot of this stuff going down. And when you look at all the work of Pessimists Archive over the years, you realize, wow, they can almost always be grouped by one of these sets of people. And these people are generally, again, they're the elites in society. They're the ones with control. They're the ones with power. And the reactionary, hysterical responses to new things are because they're protecting their power. And this runs through history as a trend.
You could have called this Lewis's hierarchy of pessimism, and why I frame it like that is when you either today or throughout history, or has it changed over time, is there one of these groups that's at the bottom, that is the instigator of the pessimism, or is it this kind of weird they're all in sync thing? Again, has that changed over time?
It's always one or a few. Sometimes it's all of them. I think right now with AI stuff, it feels like all of them at once, right? Because it depends on what areas it's touching in. But it's always a few sort of together. And again, it depends. How fast is the technology accelerating, and how much disruption and how much power redistribution is happening because of the technology? And it always depends on that. But what's funny is there's an eighth P, which isn't part of the 7 Deadly Cynics, and I say it's the proletariat. It's the regular Joes that don't have much power, don't have much control. And obviously when it comes to automation, sometimes they can get certain groups of the working class can get angry. But generally they embrace this stuff because it empowers them. Because they don't have that much to lose. It can only benefit them. It can only, the ability to broadcast or publish things on social media, again, that's a net positive for an individual without any, they don't have contacts to do an opinion piece. They don't own a newspaper. Their voices would never really be heard. And another fascinating thing I find is children are always so optimistic about technology. They embrace new things with very little hesitation. To the, adults hate this and they feel very uncomfortable with it. But again, kids don't really have much power. They don't have much autonomy. They don't have any money. They can't drive. They can't, they don't have much control over their lives, and they don't have much power. The parents do. They have a lot of control over children, their children and other people's children in schools. And so that's part of why there's always this big sort of generational clash around a new technology and the adults, right? The pagers were banned across America, blaming, apparently drug dealers were using them to sell drugs in schools, and they were made illegal in a bunch of states, and age limits were brought in. The Walkman around a similar time frame, and its parents, the adults they didn't like that, the kids were listening to music they didn't approve of in private with headphones on, or they were paging each other and communicating without, adult supervision. And smartphones are very similar. It's sort of bringing all this together into one device where there's this whole world there that adults don't have access to, and it's intimidating and it's scary and it's a loss of control and power. And obviously, parents have to exert some authority and control over kids, so it's part of bringing kids up. But you see it spill out into really hysterical stuff, which ends up being pretty unproductive generally. But the sort of lesson over the 10 years of Pessimists Archive was everyone hates technology. It's no, the newspapers stuff we work with, I realize this is just the elites because it's the newspapers. They own the printing presses, the newspapers. So the mainstream media are the elites. And the reason the mainstream media is so cynical about new things is because it threatens their power. And you saw this, there's a fun post we did about War of the Worlds and how there was this famous story of it. People were hearing this dramatized radio address about aliens landing, and there was hysteria in the streets, and someone had a heart attack, and there was, uprisings and riots. It turns out that basically was almost completely fabricated by the newspapers, who felt threatened by the radio, who saw it as an unreliable source of news and information, and it was eating into their ad revenue. Now that sounds familiar, right? So yeah, that's the big lesson. And actually it's quite an elitist, classist thing to be anti-tech. And there's a certain set on the left who see this as like class solidarity, anti-tech stuff, and they sort of idolize the Luddites and things. But if you actually look back at the Luddites, they weren't. The Luddites weren't like working class peasants. The Luddites were actually an elite creative class who didn't like the idea that suddenly lower classes would be able to, without a 7-year apprenticeship, was what a lot of them were demanding, could just work in a factory because it downskilled the ability to make clothes. Obviously, there's a lot more depth to that stuff. The factory owners weren't treating people fairly. They were hiring children. There were lots of legitimate things to critique there. But the Luddites were not, a bedraggled working class set. They were again, that reactionary hysterical response was rooted in a loss of power, which again is the running theme here. Because at the end of the day, actually, we all embrace technology: clothes, shoes, glasses, houses. I mean, no one's actually scared of technology. They're scared of a loss of control and power, essentially.
The 7 Deadly Cynics, they work together. It seems like an incredibly powerful group when they get going. You've studied, I think, more the history of technology more than anyone I know. What ends up defeating this group? What's their kryptonite?
Yeah, so what you find is in a free and open democracy, there's something there. So in a free and open democracy and a free market or a free-ish market, this stuff can proliferate, and if it proliferates fast enough, then it becomes a liability in an election. So Uber did this. They were like, people love there's a tipping point where something spreads so fast and is so useful, and the regular people are using it so much that the politicians are like, okay, well, we could do the union thing and we'll get all the union votes and the donations from the unions, but there's a lot of regular people that want cheaper taxi rides. So then, so you need a free market or free-ish market, and you need, technology to spread at a certain rate where it becomes untenable. And what you find in undemocratic countries, or not, many undemocratic countries, is you find protectionism prevails, and usually because the powerful group that is worried about losing power is the government, because they're the sort of like the main power in society. And you look at Iran right now with the internet shutdown. It's a great example. They were very wary of having the internet, and obviously they built the infrastructure to shut it down to preserve power. But the interesting thing about the internet was that it wasn't really tenable for a country to not be connected to the internet, unless you were North Korea, right? There's no way you could interface with the West without having a semi-free and open internet, which is kind of interesting. But we're seeing, Iran's a great example. There's all these Starlinks that have been smuggled in that are empowering the people, and the politicians are scared of losing that power. So I think what defeats it: freedom, democracy, free markets.
The example of Uber is very good, and I guess Airbnb is kind of fighting that battle right now. How do you think about the ones that have lost, at least over the past 50 years? Nuclear kind of lost, supersonic, drones was losing for a decade. Is that because that stuff is a little bit more in the background? It's not as in your face, or how do you think about the...
Well, so nuclear was in... The thing about nuclear is, as a technology, you can make a convincing case for it being an existential risk or a catastrophic risk with a weapons side of it. And then obviously the civilian use, again, there was this scary idea of meltdown, certainly a risk, certainly an overstated risk. And it was very easy to do a horror story around that. And I think you had lots of things at play. You had obviously the Soviet Union wanting to suppress that stuff in the West. There was probably propaganda going on around with that. You also, there was also the West being weird about countries that weren't like part of the kind of alliance having, because like Iran, like you're worried they're enriching uranium. So there was certainly the East was trying to stop the West doing it. The West was trying to stop the East doing it. And then obviously you had the useful idiots, environmentalists that, were very, I'm sure there was some of that was probably funded or it helped in some way by the Soviet Union. And then obviously there were Western politicians that were leaning into that. So the nuclear stuff is, it feels like a modern day sort of Prometheus myth come to life, and this sort of amazing lesson in risk and reward and fear. And we're now seeing the consequences of that. But there's a shift in our thinking around it, I think, which is good, especially with Ukraine and Russia and Germany stuff happening. GMOs. So I would say that the pessimists have won on some of the key critical technologies for like the future of civilization. And so nuclear energy is one, genetic engineering is another. It's still extremely hard to develop genetically engineered crops. Europe's still very hostile to them. There's the Philippines and some other countries the Philippines specifically still preventing golden rice, vitamin A enriched rice being grown by farmers, which would save millions of kids' lives and stop many more hundreds of thousands going blind. Still happening. So that's a big deal. These fundamental, nuclear, genetic engineering, where we're kind of starting to make technologies that reprogram physics and biology. And I think to me, artificial intelligence feels like the sort of third pillar there. And it scares me that the narrative around them is so similar to the nuclear stuff and the GMO stuff, that, the reactionary speculative risk stuff, the horror stories, the ignoring the upsides. Ironically, part of the AI fear mongering is around someone could build a nuclear weapon, someone could genetically engineer this. So they're sort of pulling all that stuff in. Meanwhile, it's like, wow, global warming is much worse than it needed to be. Russia's had much more leverage than it needed to have relative to having nuclear power developed. And so I would say it's in some ways technologies are inevitable, and then in others it's like, no, like we really can stop them, especially when they're really sort of 0 to 1 crazy reprogramming atoms stuff. That feels like there's a big risk there. So the smaller stuff, the Walkman or the Game Boy or smartphones will cause some backlash, but it's the really key technologies which I think are a bigger risk of this stuff. And I would say, again, the internet and the decentralization of broadcast and information is another key technology that's emerged in the last 50 years, and it's currently under massive attack. Anonymity is under attack, age gating the internet, encryption's being attacked, VPNs in the UK are maybe going to be banned. So there is this full frontal attack on the free and open internet, which has consequences around free speech and privacy. So, in some ways, technology is accelerating and proliferating and it feels unstoppable. And then in other ways, you've got these key technologies, like totally new things that are just being massively suppressed. And in the name of creating a safer tomorrow, in the name of avoiding techno-dystopia, and I wrote it last April, I wrote in The Guardian about how Black Mirror has conditioned us to feel like we should fear the future and we need to go back. And actually, that historically is a mistake. Historically, you jump back 100 years, things are worse, things are more dystopian, things are more risky. And we seem to be doing that. We seem to be running backwards and fearing the future more than the past and the present, which I think is a terrible mistake.
I was reading an old Tim Urban blog post today about his trip to North Korea, and he said North Korea is the only place that you go where the museum about the past seems like actually you want to go back there. Usually it's, you go into a museum about the past, about a country, Britain, America,
Yes.
whatever, and you're like, God, thank God I don't live, 200 years ago.
Right.
In North Korea, it's like, oh wow, the 40s or 50s were great times. Before we get back to the 7 Deadly Cynics, how do you weigh the balance of power between the optimists and the pessimists on AI today? Because it seems like it's really shifted over the past year or so.
Yeah, it's a weird one. I know that the Biden admin had, a lot of the sort of effective altruists who believe AI existential risk is a very possible outcome. We're quite embedded and influential there. Obviously, Trump's in now. There's a lot of AI optimism rhetoric. But then at the same time, there are different sects of the right in America, and there's the tech right, there's the MAGA right, which has sort of like more leans towards Steve Bannon. And Bannon is very reactionary on AI. He's very sort of anti-AI.
He said we should nationalize SpaceX as well when the all Elon stuff went down.
I mean, he's very reactionary that and actually, so there's also this strange sort of small clique of people on the right that kind of like the Unabomber's manifesto. It starts talking about culture war and it's quite sort of anti-left and anti-feminism. And they've kind of latched onto some of that stuff. And it's been, I imagine Bannon probably, feels warmly towards parts of that thing. And at the end of the day, technophobia is quite a populist and reactionary thing in the context of, I think, certainly in the context of jobs. So I said how the less powerful are generally in favor of it, but if you can sort of make vague predictions that this is a threat to a livelihood, then you can certainly whip regular people up into a fervor to be anti-AI. I think there's been states in America that have banned lab-grown meat. It's not going to be commercialized for another 10, 15, 20 years, but Texas just banned it, completely banned it. And that, again, it was appealing to kind of populist sentiments around culture. We we love steaks, we rear cattle, we're farmers, blah, blah, blah. So in some ways, it can be used to appeal to a wider audience in cases. And so I worry that, and I've long seen this, is because generally the main political parties are sort of enmeshed with the establishment in various ways. I think in the US, it's the Democrats more enmeshed in academia and the mainstream media that lean progressive. And then the Republicans are more enmeshed with business and big established businesses, and they lean more right. And both those groups, from the 7 Deadly Cynics, it's the protectionists, so big businesses, the the professors in academia, and the publishers, they're sort of, whether it's right or left, they're progressives or more right, they generally have lots of reasons to oppose new things. And generally what you find is true libertarians are really, really great on tech stuff, emerging tech stuff. They're really great on, not being principled, not getting into fear-mongering, and not justifying state overreach because of a bunch of theoretical risks. So they're very reliable when it comes to good tech policy. And you saw this in the late 90s, early 2000s with encryption in the US. A lot of libertarians helped stop this stuff. And I think there are some exceptions. I think that especially politicians appealing to younger voters are generally more pro-tech because, again, younger people have less to lose and they're not all sort of nostalgic. So you see politicians like AOC, who has a lot of younger voters. Surprisingly, she's pushes back on some of this stuff to appeal to younger voters generally. I think in the UK, you have the rise of Reform. This is Nigel Farage's alternative right party. And it has a lot of young voters for whatever reason. They just lowered the voting age to 16 too, which is interesting. Meanwhile, all the major parties in the UK are behind this age gating the internet, give us your ID, ban kids from here, there and everywhere, lock down the VPNs, and Reform are the only party against it. The only mainstream, or becoming mainstream more and more every day. And it's because they're appealing to younger voters. So I think when it comes to politics, the reliable pro-tech people that aren't going to give in to these 7 deadly cynics is one's appealing to younger voters and principled libertarians generally. And I think everyone else is going to end up being pulled in.
If I'm a founder building a disruptive technology, something new, which of the 7 groups do you think I should try to win over first? Or is it just a case of building a great product? Or should I have a strategy for this?
Well, it's interesting. So e-cigarettes are an interesting example because I think some of the earlier companies sold to the big tobacco, which ended up, it became an incumbent. Now, obviously, that was pretty bad. That was pretty bad PR. But that's certainly, I'm not saying sell out. I just thought I'd bring this up as an example. The irony around the e-cigarettes is that the people that e-cigarettes threatened didn't end up being the tobacco companies, which could have been the enemies of e-cigarettes, but they ended up acquiring them. And they're we just want to sell people nicotine. We don't care if it's, in a leaf or not form. So the funny thing about the anti-e-cigarette stuff is that there was a whole industry, non-profit industry around lowering tobacco consumption. It was the anti-big tobacco set. E-cigarettes were an existential risk to them because what are they going to, if everyone starts doing e-cigarettes, then it's not tobacco, and then the whole many of the older health scare stuff disappears. And so what you saw was very weirdly, the people resisting e-cigarettes and fighting e-cigarettes were the people that were fighting cigarettes. So that's an interesting thing where sometimes the power that it threatens isn't always obvious. So sometimes it's the people that opposed the old thing now oppose this. It kind of feels a bit like nuclear, where the the environmentalists were if everything's nuclear, like, what are we going to do? But your question was, who would you try and win over first? You don't try and win over. None of them. You try and win over people. You try and win over the people. You try and get this thing scaling. You try and get it growing fast, and so fast that it becomes a liability to oppose it. And so with Uber, like you saw with Uber, they would encourage people in certain areas to write to their lawmakers and things. So you win over the people, and that's going to make it much easier to win over the politicians because they need votes. And that would be my advice.
If I look at this group, it's usually the politicians painted as like, those are the bad guys, those are the ones that make the laws. Is there any group that you think people really underestimate in these 7? For me, parents is. I have 3 kids. I think parents is an incredibly powerful one.
Yeah, parents is a really powerful one. I think especially when you have some awful tragic thing where there's a freak accident involving a new thing, and you have parents going through the worst imaginable grief, and sadly what happens is politicians sort of use them to get a law passed. So they'll wheel them out in Congress, and nobody, no one's going to argue with grieving parents. And oftentimes something bad will happen to the child, and the parents will be looking for something to blame. So this happened with comic books and novels, and their kid does a terrible crime, or they kill someone, and they blame. I think often it's defense lawyers as well, are like, what could we blame this on? And they blame it on comic books, radio, video games. School shooting happens. They blame it on video games. This happened with Columbine. And so the parents, and there the parents give this opportunity to protectionists, politicians, and publishers. So the newspapers love a big front page story. Video game causes school shooting, sell loads of newspapers, these great stories that get attention. Politicians love it because they get to write a law and wheel out the parents and get all this attention and make it look like they're protecting kids. Even professors, they're like, great, there's grant opportunities for video game violence research. Like, I'm going to apply for that, And so I think parents certainly, and we're seeing this with the smartphone stuff, that the free and open internet and the free world is collapsing before our very eyes. And it's happening partly through preachers, which is like Jonathan Haidt. And then it's like this grassroots or semi-grassroots parental thing of like parent-teacher associations and stuff. And it's doing a massive amount of harm. So I'd say parents are that underestimated group. And I would say beyond just people, I'd say it's probably worth winning over parents if there's any way of doing that.
If you could remove one group from the loop, what do you think would most weaken the cycle?
Well, politicians, but then you just have anarchy, which I didn't think is practical. But so I think publishers. So centralized publishing. So it's obviously publishing is becoming less centralized over the last 2-3 decades. So that's quite interesting and promising. And what you find with TikTok, there's a partly why TikTok is so derided, I think, and there's some good critiques of it, whatever. But it's the first time that the youth have had a real broadcast medium with video, audio, everything. They have a camera in their pocket and they're able to broadcast and stuff. And that feels very threatening. Obviously, the China stuff's very real in terms of their influence over its algorithms and things. But there is this element of the youth seizing the means of broadcast, which is very interesting. And what you find on TikTok is it's just a very different narrative around technology. It's much less cynical. It's much less hand-wringing. There's a lot more looking at the positives. It's not all that, but it's an interesting thing to look at that group on the list, publishers being disintermediated and having a less powerful group being able to broadcast and seeing what happens. So I'd say publishers, and I think in many ways they are, that sort of group is, their power is waning. It's part of why they're so hysterical and aggressive. And I do hope that more decentralized media in the hands of more people, younger people, less powerful people, will mean less predictable, cynical narratives around technology.
You might say publishers are falling in status. Which of the groups is rising in status?
Right now, yeah, I mean, right now, parents and politicians seem to be, you've got all these politicians getting behind this stuff left and right. You have all these parents groups. It does feel like there is this politicians, parents, and preachers, as they do, coming together, and they've never been more powerful and dangerous, in my opinion. I think the impact they're having is scaring me, and yeah, and obviously,
Is are politicians the group that are most historically effective at killing a breakthrough, or has that changed over time?
Yeah, because at the end of the day, people are just going to do it. It's going to scale. They're going to sell it. At the end of the day, there are more optimists than pessimists. It's just, where's the power? Which groups have more power? And so the diffusion of innovation theory as a loose framework for this stuff is a good example. And you have the sort of groups in society that adopt things really early and a bit later, and then really late. And in a free and open market system where there's a freedom of press, so you can hear about these technologies, and there's not overregulation, which has certainly become a problem. These things are just going to end up happening. And politicians are able to just stroke of a pen and it's over. Too much red tape and it's over. Too much risk and uncertainty and it's over. So it really does come down to the politicians, and this is why there's this like, big tech is spending so much on lobbying. It's like, well, yeah, I mean, yeah, because they can just a stroke of a pen and it's all over, and of course they are. And I think people say, oh, it's they're spending $100 million on lobbying, and it's undemocratic. They're manipulating democracy. It's like people just. It's like there's a reason, because the power that politicians have is to just stop things dead. So there just doesn't seem to be a concept of freedom of technology. There's a freedom of press. There's in America, right to bear arms, right? It's like there isn't a constitution on earth where there's sort of a right to innovate or something along those lines, or treating innovation as speech, right?
Yes.
Yes. And so I think it's important to think along those lines too, like what is freedom, what is free in society, what is the free world? I think the free world, everyone agrees the free world has free and open elections, free press, free speech, right to assemble, and then sort of innovation or innovating or doing something in a new and interesting way, it's like, oh, you can't do that without a license. You can't. So there probably needs to be some more thought along those lines in the context of regulation.
How do you think about the entry of China into all of this? And where I'm going is that I often think about China as this magic word. If you say it in Washington 3 times, a politician will come out of the woodwork and hand you $1 billion. It seems like we have to unban drones because China is getting ahead in drones. China is doing a lot more nuclear than us. Let's accelerate nuclear. China is trying to build supersonic jets. We have to unban supersonic. So in a weird way, China is obviously a closed society. But it's almost the reason for re-accelerating technological progress in the West right now.
Yeah, this sort of played out in the Cold War and the space race, right? It's good. Some healthy competition is good. And China is this interesting. China's interesting because they do steal a lot of technology from the West. They sort of reap the fruits of the capitalist system themselves. And they also, because they're an autocracy and the press is controlled by the government, they're able to scale that technology quicker than us, right? Which is this funny thing. And because they own the press, so there are no elections, some of this stuff... Obviously, they, again, like I mentioned previously, they're going to want to preserve their power in various ways. There's a great firewall and all this stuff, and they don't want stuff that's going to undermine their power. But they're not going to let a protectionist, semi-private company start influencing the media around this stuff. Although I would say the state in China does whip up fear around some Western technologies. I think iPhones, there was a bit of stuff around that. But they scale faster. There's less opposition to stuff. And partly because they don't have a free press. And like I said, the free press are like an integral... a free press inevitably becomes centralized to a few wealthy groups. And those wealthy groups are generally part of the establishment incumbent class. And so they do end up leaning tech pessimists because they are protectionists. And they're generally older generations, which also plays into it. And China doesn't have that. So I think when it comes to competing with China, we need to figure out, the conversation needs to be, how does the free world with a free press and free and open elections also innovate? Like, how do we have a free world with the freedom to innovate as well as the freedom of speech, free and open elections? I think it's really important that, and if we don't get on top of that, we don't figure it out, we could lose. And so I think, stuff like this framework is very useful to untangling that conundrum. That riddle,
just on the winning point, I guess AI is the perfect example that's playing out in real time right now. Do you think, I mean, we talked about the balance of optimism and pessimism in AI, but how basically who is playing which role right now of the 7 Deadly Cynics in the AI kind of battle? It seems like politicians have kind of flipped pro.
There's a very weird dynamic where it's growing so fast that you have these AI companies sort of becoming incumbents really fast. So OpenAI and Anthropic. Obviously, you've got Google there, which is much more of a older incumbent. But you have a weird merger of like preachers and protectionists together, which is these AI effective altruist X-risk people who are like, incumbents, they're sort of protectionists, and they're also preaching the end is nigh, and they're working the politicians and the publishers really well. The press love this stuff, and the politicians love this stuff, and they're also embedded in academia. So because there's a lot of these AI experts people in academia in the Ivy League, so you have protectionists, preachers, and professors all sort of wrapped up into one set group of people, and they have this, and then there's patrons, so these billionaires who are funding this AI extra stuff, who are funding the protectionist professors and preachers who are all in one group to lobby the politicians and publishers. They're doing a very good job of it, and they're trying to scare parents now. Parents are the sort of the next frontier, chatbot stuff. A lot of them are funding lawsuits around AI chatbot harm. So it's all playing out. It's every single one of them, all playing out at once. And it's a very good way of understanding this space, I think.
I almost think of this as like a criminal case. Like these are all witnesses, and which witness is, or which person involved in the case, which one is most likely to flip pro-tech under the right incentives, either not specifically in AI, but just in general, studying the history of technology. Which one's the easiest to flip?
I think so. There's publishers and editors, but I do think editors are more cynical and manipulative than journalists. I think journalists want to be accurate. They want to tell the truth, and they feel very uncomfortable when they make mistakes, and they're not, I'm not talking about tabloid stuff, I'm talking about legit stuff. So I like the idea that Pessimists Archive has helped, and hopefully some editors too, to get a bit more perspective, and has had some journalists sort of go, is this story really, like, am I just doing that thing? Like, is this a cliche? Do I want to think about this in a more interesting and deeper way? So I think I have a lot of faith that journalists and some in publishers have a spot. Again, when I say professors, don't mean all professors, and lots of academics care about truth in the same way. And I think, again, they need more encouragement and more backup around this. There's some really great ones out there. So those two, professors and publishers, journalists, are probably good. I think there could be a lot more done to say to parents, hey, your kids watching Coco Melon on their iPad, but like there's a whole world of information. Kids are creative and they're curious, and they have a magic pane of glass where they can explore any interest they want. You can control that consumption via parental controls. This is an amazing tool. It's not a TV. TVs were much more, static, much more hard to regulate. You had you were prescribed content more than searching it and exploring interests. So I just think there's a massive missed opportunity around saying to parents, hey, they could waste a lot of time and just sit around watching slop or something, but like there's this amazing opportunity. Publishers, parents, professors, there's a good opening there. Preachers are going to keep preaching. Politicians are downstream, I think. If the publishers and the professors and the parents, you win over some of them, then it's going to be downstream from politicians. But I would say that there is a kind of, so I'm calling it also the pyramid of pessimism, because it's sort of a pyramid of power. At the top you have the patrons, and then you have the protectionists and the publishers, and it's sort of a hierarchy of power going down. I think parents are sort of at the bottom. And I came up with this idea of having, like, what's the reverse? Like, what's the inverted here? What's the pyramid of progress? And so I think the pyramid of progress is patrons that believe in the future. So wealthy people that believe in the future, and there's lots of them. I think Bill Gates is a great example of this. He fights anti-GMO stuff. He fights anti-vaccine stuff. He's become a sort of tech antichrist for a lot of reactionaries. So we need patrons that are optimistic and they want progress, in the same way that you've got the ones that are protecting. And then you have the Prometheans, so they're the daring innovators. You want publishers that don't sway cynical. You want, Free Think Media is a great one. They do Big Think, and they have a very specific angle. You have people like Cleo Abrams doing great YouTube content and TikTok content about the future. So you want to build this pyramid of progress. You want preachers who are preaching progress, and you have the progress movement, progress studies. You have some great voices there. Again, you want professors that are getting good funding for their research that isn't inevitably going to try and come to some cynical conclusion. It also needs to not end up being just sort of industry-funded research, which ends up being ignored anyway. You've got to figure out that. And then you want politicians who sell hope. They sell solutions. They don't sell problems. And I think Obama was a good one. His rhetoric was very optimistic. Biden felt like he was always talking about problems. And I guess that I've tried to do 7, and the last one is just pragmatists of all types everywhere that are just pragmatic. They're looking for solutions. So I think there needs to, when you understand the pyramid of pessimism, you need to understand these are very specific demographics, and I think personality types in a way, very specific personality types. And there needs to be, and there is in some ways, it's not that organized, but there needs to be a counter to it, which is kind of a similar pyramid that's sort of structured in a similar way to fight back against that very organized, concerted, predictable pattern of pushing back on things, which I think stretches back thousands of years. If you look at the Prometheus myth in Greek mythology, it feels to me like they were just describing this, right? So the gods had fire, and then it was democratized by Prometheus, and they were really angry, and then they persecuted him for it. So it feels to me like the Greeks understood that powerful people preserve power protesting progress, right? And that's just how it is. And this is the thing. And I'd say the last 50 years has showed that that's, as technology accelerates, that accelerates too. And it becomes more extreme. And it feels to me like we're really at this scary sort of point where it's coming at everything from all angles. Anonymity, the open internet, freedom to compute, and AI and privacy. And I just can't get out of my head that we're creating the kind of things you read about in 1984 in the name of avoiding techno-dystopia. These people are ending up making it more likely. So.
Do you think, as you mentioned, the anti-tech sentiments, anti-innovation sentiments have been around for thousands of years, and you've documented that brilliantly at Pessimists Archive. But do you think they've grown in strength over the past 50 years?
Yeah, just because things have accelerated, nuclear stuff, genetic engineering, we're really becoming gods among men, and so it certainly has. And I think it's important to remember also, like, new technologies bring new order, and new order brings new disorder, right? Like, things do start disorderly, and then you have to figure out how to make them orderly. It's the history of human civilization. So new technologies do bring new order does bring new disorder. The old order tend to say, oh, look at this disorder, you need to give us more our power back in order to bring back order to things. So they always want to do that. They want to take things back. But generally, we just need a bit of time to reorder things and manage the new disorder. And I think that disintermediating broadcast certainly made it easier for more disinformation to be published, right? It doesn't mean it got distribution. It didn't necessarily increase the demand or the time people have for it, which I think is always an assumption. But Wikipedia very early in the internet proved that we can have disintermediated publishing and broadcast, and it's possible to create new ways to manage disorder. And I think community notes is like a very interesting extension of that, which the old order, who have sort of monopolized the conversation about disinformation and truth, aren't interested in talking about community notes. They're not interested, even though it's a very good tool for dealing with disinformation that's more subtle or contextual or not. It's not the kind of thing that can be put on a list of things to moderate, right? It's like very flexible, and it can deal with a slight distortion of a fact or a breaking news story that's just happened. It can correct some misunderstanding right away. So when you have people talking about tech ethics and tech risk reduction and safety around stuff, you have to figure out what's their motivation. And what you generally find is the more prohibitionary they are, the more likely it is that they're a protectionist or they're a preacher. So they think the end is nigh and we must stop it. So like some of these AI people. So when it comes to thinking about technology risk, that's what you need to do. You've got to figure out who is worrying in good faith, and they're not just worrying about their own power and influence. And the reason that's important is because a lot of time is wasted worrying about or focusing on the wrong things. Predicting outcomes and risk of new technologies is pretty hard, in the same way that predicting the upsides is hard. So this is what investors do, right? They're trying to predict the upsides of technology, and we know the hit rate is extremely low on actually accurately predicting what those upsides are. So, but and a lot of anti-tech people laugh at how many companies of tech VCs end up losing money on, right? But then for some reason, they don't think that applies in the other direction, that their cynical narratives about how technology is going to cause problems is also, 99% of the time, probably not going to pan out. And if it's really hard to predict the risks of a new technology, and there are all these misaligned incentives, self-interest, cognitive biases, going on, then if you really want to identify problems and mitigate them early, you have to take all that seriously. And what I find is people who have a sort of knee-jerk dismissal of Pessimists Archive, it's just such a tell that they're not acting in good faith, because generally they're part of one of those groups, and I think deep down they know it, and they get really defensive and and it could just be subconscious, but they go, oh, well, it's different this time. It doesn't, things have changed. And I say, well, for a new medium or new technology to even become to scale, it has to be sufficiently different and better than the previous one, right? So it has to be more entertaining, it has to be faster, it has to be whatever. So it's always different this time. It's not a good reason why these fears are suddenly much more, often it's not a good argument, really. And I always say it's because it is different this time, it's always different this time, but human psychology isn't different, it's the same. And when it's in a similar area like publishing, then the psychology that plays out is the people who are gatekeepers to publishing and what's thought of as truth feel threatened, and they act out and they overemphasize problems with the new thing. And so it's just really important and useful to think about it through that lens.
Is there anything different about this era of tech pessimism? Is there anything unique, or it's just like literally the same playbook we saw in the early internet, same playbook we saw in the 70s and gone back forward?
It's different because things scale faster, which is good. And then it's different because regulation can be, in some areas, can be applied so quickly. So in the UK, suddenly, Online Safety Act, everyone show me your papers, give me your ID, and that happened overnight. So there's a duality there where things scale faster, which is good. They can reach tipping point, which makes politicians more wary of coming down on this stuff. But also, especially in the digital world, there's more danger of overregulation because things can happen very quickly. And we know governments aren't very good at organizing things and scaling things. But in the digital world, the competency level doesn't need to be as high, so they're able to roll draconian things out much more quickly, which is why we should be a lot more worried about the risk of knee-jerk reactions to new things.
How optimistic, or how are you thinking about the renaissance in hard tech? So you're seeing nuclear, supersonic, drones, cloud seeding. It seems like we've kind of left SaaS is dead. You have a bunch of recovering SaaS investors that are really excited about deep tech, hard tech, which is actually, when you think about it, it's 85% of GDP, the actual physical world. How do you see that fitting into the framework?
It's exciting. But it doesn't feel like, it doesn't feel like people are treating technophobia as a risk to the future enough still. And you have the Black Mirror kind of narrative around fearing the future, and technological acceleration begets dystopian outcomes. It's hard to, and then another part of me is like, maybe all of the worrying is focused on AI and social media and smartphones, and perhaps there must be some limit to this stuff, and perhaps that absorbs all the panic, and the world of atoms can be left alone a bit more. To develop, but I'm not. Yeah, it's hard to.
There's definitely going to be a bull market and lobbyists, that's for sure.
Yes, well, of course. I mean, the world of atoms, as Thiel says, it has been extremely constrained, and the world of bits has had a sort of freedom to develop and accelerate. So yeah, I mean, the competition with China will hopefully make that seem more urgent.
Totally. Maybe as we gear towards closing here, when people look back at Pessimists Archive in 100 years from now, what do you think is going to be the most hilarious moral panic of the last 20 years? Something now that seems...
right now, I think the things are changing so fast, and kids need to be ready for that new world. And I think people are going to look back and go, what on earth were we doing? Banning them from chatbots, taking smartphones out of schools, forcing college students to not use AI and start doing paper exams. Like, why were we taking the entire education system and moving it back 50 years while the whole world was moving forward 50 years every month? Like, what were we doing? What a failure of the whole institution. Supposed to get people ready to work and be adults and have a career, and the whole system has just taken this Luddite turn, and it's just going to seem just embarrassing and ridiculous, I think.
I thought to end, Lewis, we could play a little fun game. So I'm going to give you 7 one-liners that sound like something that one of the 7 deadly cynics would say. But I want you to, I'm going to say the line and you have to tell me which of the 7 deadly cynics is most likely to say it, okay?
Okay, let's go.
Technology is moving too fast.
Parents.
Only the super rich are going to benefit from this.
Politicians.
We need to hit the pause button for safety.
Oh, protectionists.
It's going to take all the jobs.
Protectionists.
There should be a law against this before someone is killed or someone else is killed.
Preachers and politicians.
It will ruin the very fabric of society.
Publishers and preachers.
It's rotting
They
our
work hand
brains.
in hand. Parents.
Louis Anslow, founder of the Pessimists Archive. Where can people find out more about you? Tell everyone what they need to know.
My Twitter is at Louis Anslow, Louis, Louis, whatever. The Pessimist Archive is pessimistarchive.org. And the Twitter is Pessimists Arc, Pessimists ARC. Yeah.
And I know you have something big cooking for 2026 with the Pessimists Archive. What can people look forward to?
Yeah, lots of website relaunch. Going to publish something on the 7 Deadly Cynics, some short, a long essay. Probably going to print a booklet for that. Going to be doing a lot more podcasts and have a lot more guest posts, and probably going to be doing some video stuff. So,
love it. One of my favorite websites on the internet. Make sure you check it out. Talk to you soon.